This is actually the afternoon of April the 26th, the same day that I created the previous video, although since I got up so early, it seems like the next day. These scholars want textual analysis. They want style analysis. Now, I can't give it to them the way they want it, by the rules that they want it, but I have said that this kind of analysis of style is the weakest of my evidence. I didn't mean it was weak. I meant that the other evidence was stronger, So if you go back a couple days to my entry of the 24th, where I read one of Matthew's precursors to A Christmas Carol, I gave the explanation as to where it is found. It's found in this book, The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Stories, supposedly by Francis A. Durivage. Was actually plagiarized from Matthew's portfolio. Just about everything in that book originally came from Mathew Franklin Whittier's portfolio, which went back to at least 1830 or so. I can tell that, again, by style. I've explained all of that. I can't go over everything again. I mentioned that at the very tail end of this book, immediately after that precursor, the New Year's Bells, is the very last story in the book. And it is a New Year's story, a kind of a science fiction story called The Old Year and the New. And at the very end, Durivage has tacked on the date of publication, which is 1853. But I'm betting that this was not originally written for 1853. It was probably written for maybe 1830 or 1831. And I'm going to show you why I think that. These, of course, are all claimed by Durivage, as I said. They're all Matthew's. I can prove it like 1,000 times over, various ways. But I'm going to show you a comparison of style. Now, this one I don't have a physical copy of, but I do happen to have a PDF photographic copy from the Hathi Trust, so I'm going to put that on the screen while I am reading from my Kindle Fire here. This one was published in the New England Magazine in the December 1832 edition. And I know 100% that it's Mathew Franklin Whittier's work because he signed it with his star, which was his signature since 1830, all the way toward like 1873 is the last time he uses the star that I know of. All in the interim, that was his secret go-to signature, including work which is falsely attributed to Margaret Fuller. We won't get into that now. But this particular story in the December 1832 edition of the New England Magazine, and Mathew had worked for this editor before, they were friends. It is signed with a star. It's definitely Mathew's, and it's in a very, very similar style to this last story in the compilation that Francis Durivage wrote. So let's see, here is my copy. So which shall I do first? I think that I will read the one in the New England Magazine that's signed with a star first, because we know for sure that's Mathew Franklin Whittier's work, or I know for sure it is because it's his signature. And it's a little bit longish. Should I read all of it or should I read a portion of it to give you an idea? I feel like I should go ahead and read the whole thing. And if you don't want to read all of it, you can kind of move the cursor along, find the end of the story, and, so you can listen to as much of it as you want, but I want it on tape, as it were. So this is called The Course of Time, an Allegory. I should mention here before I start that Mathew wrote several science fiction-ish type stories about this age. 1832, December, we're talking 20 years old, so from maybe age 18 or younger, he was writing science fiction type stories, including a series about a man who goes to the moon in a rocket ship. This is before Edgar Allan Poe published any prose that I know of. That's also another story. So this is a genre that Mathew has written in elsewhere. And I will take a sip of water before I start. I'm going to run right on through this. The Course of Time, an Allegory. I had been drinking champagne. My sleep was uneasy. I began to dream. Methought I was awakened out of a quiet and profound slumber by a loud rumbling as if of heavy wagons driven furiously along a paved road, mixed with a brisk rattle as of light carriages joined with a clattering of hoofs and a trampling of feet, intermingled now and then with sounds somewhat more definite, as of trumpets bellowing, fiddles screeching, men shouting, women crying, drums, bassoons, Jews' harps, clarionets, and hand organs. This odd combination of sounds seemed at first to strike upon my ear as if from a great distance, but growing louder and louder, it soon roused me from my slumbers. I sprang upon my feet and began to look about me. Methought it was broad daylight, and as I looked around, I perceived that I had been sleeping by the side of a dusty, wide, well-traveled highway, leading to, I knew not what, great metropolis. This road was roughly paved with stones of all dimensions. Its surface was very uneven, and it was full of holes and ruts innumerable. I found myself standing at the foot of a high pillar, or rather obelisk, which was placed close by the roadside and towered far above my head, serving, as I conjectured, among other purposes, as a landmark or milestone. At any rate, it had emblazoned upon it in large golden letters 1832 caps, which, from some reason or other, but what I can scarcely tell, seemed to me to contain some reference to the length of the road. In the side of this obelisk was an arched door, into which I entered and began to ascend a winding staircase, cut, as it were, from the solid rock. This stairway carried me at length to the top of the obelisk. Here was a platform a few feet square, surrounded by an iron railing, and as the country on all sides, as far as the eye would reach, was perfectly flat, the prospect around was quite extensive. As I stretched my eye along the road, I discovered at a distance an immense cloud of dust, out of which the uproar by which I had been awakened, and which continued to grow louder and louder, seemed to proceed. I kept my eye fixed on this rolling cloud, pregnant with so many thunders, and now and then, as the sunshine penetrated its folds and glanced upon polished metal, perhaps, or glittering arms, a gleam of brightness burst forth, which to my excited fancy seemed almost to emulate the lightnings. This moving mass of dust continued to approach at a very rapid rate, till at length, being now quite near, it burst asunder, and rolling off to the right and left, betrayed the pageant concealed beneath it. In front, drawn by 12 prancing steeds, all white with foam, came dashing on, swift as the winged tempest, an iron chariot. Its wheels were armed with glittering scythes that swept the whole width of the gracious highway. Fear, large and small caps, held the reins, and hope continually applied the lash. In the center, erect and motionless, clad from head to foot in black armor, his arms folded, and resting on a tremendous scythe, whose bright and polished blade made one tremble to look at it, stood Time, the master of this equipage. I knew him at a glance. The calm and cold composure of his face, his eye fixed unceasingly on some far distant goal, and his firm air of abstract unconcern showed a soul unmoved and profoundly indifferent to all the tumult, uproar, and confusion of which he seemed to be the moving cause. The chariot of Time was surrounded by a whole host of fantastic beings, not half of whom I can at present recollect. A considerable distance before the horses' heads might be seen Rumor, pressing forward with both wings and feet, half in the air and half upon the ground. Each of his 100 tongues was busy in proclaiming the approach of time, but each, I found, told a different story. Innovation, a jolly youth, in party-colored garments, easily kept pace with the foremost horses, swinging his cap and shouting for joy, while a gray-headed old fellow, with wig, cocked hat, and gold-headed cane, called Immutability, ran panting and limping close behind him, and every now and then caught at the horse's reins in an impotent attempt to stop their career. Just on the very edge of one of the chariot sides, and every moment in danger of being cut through, ran Procrastination, still looking backwards with a face in which unconcern and agony, listlessness and apprehension were singularly mixed. Behind the chariot came a strange, mingled, motley crowd, all hurly-burly and confusion, but all pressing forward at the hottest speed, in earnest struggle to keep up with the career of time. There were vehicles of all sorts, sizes, and descriptions. The splendid coach and six, gilded and burnished and blazoned with armorial bearings, the dashing barouche, the handsome coach and four, the chariot and pair, the comfortable chaise, the showy gig with its lively tandem, the unsocial sulky, the well-stuffed carryall, to say nothing of lumbering stagecoaches, wagons heavily loaded with merchandise of all sorts, trucks, horse carts, ox teams, and, every now and then, a whole train of field pieces, heavy artillery, baggage, and ammunition wagons. But these wheel carriages made comparatively a small part of the crowd. Every sort of beast of burden seemed to have been put in requisition. Horses of all shapes, colors, and paces, asses and mules in abundance, the stately elephant, the patient camel. Even oxen, sheep, and dogs were called into service. Some, not content with these ordinary means of conveyance, might be seen mounted in the strangest style, one on an ostrich, another on an unwieldy hog, one on a rampant lion, and another on a furious bull. Men even were made to serve as beasts of burden, and many a stupid fellow was borne along on the shoulders of others who, to judge by the rules of physiognomy, were much better than himself. But after all, the far greater part of the crowd were compelled to travel on foot. Men, women, and children, more numerous than the army of Xerxes, rushed forward, jostling amid the mingled carriages and among the mounted men. All were jammed together into one solid, inextricable mass of confusion, under the influence apparently of no common principle, except that of progression onward. Every carriage, I observed, was crammed with baggage, and every rider had his well-stuffed saddlebags. Even a large number of the foot passengers had their bundles, greater or smaller, strapped upon their backs. Some, however, carried all they had, tied up in a pocket handkerchief. A vast multitude had no encumbrances at all, and a very great number, perhaps the majority of the whole, had hardly clothes enough to hide their nakedness. The common rule seemed to be that every one should look out for himself, but such was the roughness of the road, the strange confusion of the motley crowd, and the rapid pace at which they were moving, that terrible accidents happened continually. Every now and then, crash would go some vehicle or other. Every moment some horse, ass, or other loaded beast would give out, fall on the road, and die, while hundreds of the poor people on foot would drop continually to the earth, worn out with fatigue, or run down by their mounted neighbors. But, fall who might, though the richest loaded wagon or most splendid equipage came rolling to the ground, the catastrophe attracted but a moment's attention. Those who were nearest stared a second at the overthrow, and hastily snatched up whatever of the scattered valuables they could easiest lay their hands on. But the whole mass of the survivors still swept forward in their career, and those who fell were past and forgotten in the same moment. Some strange scenes were acted before my eyes during the few moments that the pageant was in sight. Those of the crowd who saw their horses likely to give out, or their vehicles to break down, would begin to throw away, as a temporary relief, whatever of their baggage came first to hand. Trunks, bandboxes, cloaks, and presently bags of money, caskets of jewels, or packages of rich merchandise. These valuables often fell into the hands of some poor shivering, half-naked foot passenger, who would be encouraged by this good fortune to press vigorously forward till, presently, taking the owner of some carriage or serviceable beast at unawares, he would pitch him from his seat, and, jumping into his place, drive on as though nothing had happened. Some splendid equipages you might see, with horses quite blown, whose owners would begin with throwing away all their superfluous baggage. Then they would dispense with their footmen and postilions. Presently, they would tumble any friend out of the coach who happened to be riding with them. Next, they would throw overboard their wives, then their children, and at length some pet greyhound or mastiff. Finally, they would begin to strip off their own clothes. but all would not save them, and soon their horses would stumble or their carriage upset, and all in a moment be trampled underfoot by the crowd. Sometimes, however, this process would be reversed, and the servants, wives, or children would begin with tumbling into the road the father, husband, or master. In the midst of this hurly-burly, there was one equipage that particularly attracted my attention. It was drawn by 24 milk-white horses, each horse guided by his own postilion. The carriage had emblazoned upon its panels the American eagle, and seemed to be occupied by a numerous company. The principal figure was a tall, slender, venerable old man in a military uniform. He was wan and careworn, and seemed so weak as to be scarcely able to support himself. The reins were held by two sneaking coachmen, whom the old officer called after every now and then by their names of Billy and Amos, but they seemed to take all their directions from a sly little fellow in pumps and silk stockings, of whom I could scarcely decide whether he was footman or favorite, but who sat crouching at the feet of the old gentleman, and looking up from time to time into his face, with a smile of mingled servility and confidence. Whoever had the direction of it, this splendid equipage seemed in very bad hands. Some of the postilions were for driving one way, and some another. One dapper little fellow in a cocked hat towards the head of the team gave an infinite deal of trouble by his blustering obstinacy, and I expected every moment that the harness would go to pieces. The carriage, too, seemed for some time in the utmost danger of upsetting. It ran a good way altogether on two wheels, and I scarcely believe it would have gone over, but just at the moment of the utmost danger, some of the other passengers very unexpectedly tumbled out, head foremost, the little fellow who had usurped the direction of it. As he fell, the carriage righted, and one of the hind wheels passed directly over his body. He writhed in agony, striving to conceal his face with a white pocket handkerchief, and muttering something about the glory of perishing in the service of such a hero. I thought it was all over with him, when he suddenly sprang upon his feet, regained the carriage with a harlequin leap, seated himself not at the old officer's feet, but on his shoulders, snatched the reins into his own hands, and drove off amid the congratulation and huzzas of all the footboys and outriders of the equipage. The whole pageant had moved on so swiftly that by this time it had quite passed, and the noise, tumult, and uproar began to grow less tremendous. As I looked backward, the road, as far as the eye could reach, was thickly strewn and even heaped with ruins. Carriages of all sorts, horses and other beasts of burden, men, women, and children, goods, chattels, and valuables of every description were piled together in utter confusion. But all was still and motionless, and I hastened to descend from my station that I might have a nearer view of these strange relics. As I picked my way with difficulty among these silent masses of distraction, the sights I saw were singular enough. Many a driver of some richly freighted team or wagon had been crushed to pieces beneath the weight of his own valuables, and had often involved in the same ruin a multitude of the people around him. Thousands of the poorer sort had been crushed to death beneath the chariot wheels of their more potent neighbors. These unlucky wretches seemed, in some instances, while in the very agony of death, to have caught at the heads of the horses by which they were trampled, and, dragging them to earth, to have involved their proud oppressors in simultaneous destruction. Some mothers I saw who had evidently perished in the attempt to save their infants from the horses' hoofs, and some children who appeared to have dragged their struggling children into the ruin by which them themselves were overwhelmed. Many, it was plain, had perished by their own folly, and many more by inevitable accidents against which no caution could have guarded. I had passed onward but a few steps when I observed, at a little distance, an object that attracted all my attention. By the wayside, in a spot less encumbered by ruins than any other part of the road that I had seen, I observed a venerable man, reclining more like one asleep than one dead, against a pile of volumes of various bindings and sizes. The expression of his face was mild and benignant, and quite free from those haggard lines of care with which the features of all those around him were more or less distracted. I approached him with reverence, and as I leaned forward to catch a more distinct view of his face, I discovered that many of the volumes composing the pile on which he reclined were lettered, the Waverley novels. I stood a long time in reverential silence and wrapped in meditation. At length, I turned to pursue my investigations, but I had passed onward only a short distance when I perceived that the light of day had faded into a twilight, which was itself rapidly diminishing. The noise of Time's cavalcade was fast dying away in the distance, and had sunk already into a low moaning, like the sound of waves on some far distant beach. All the objects around me had begun to assume a hazy and indistinct appearance. The piles of treasure and heaps of dead bodies seemed silently to sink and crumble into dust. A feeling of strange awe came over me. The whole mass of ruins with which the road had been loaded sunk imperceptibly and disappeared. I looked toward the old man and his pile of volumes. He was still distinctly visible, though all about him had vanished and left bare the rugged pavements of the road. But while I was still looking, he too began to share the common fate. His pile of volumes wasted noiselessly away. His figure and features grew indistinct, dissolved into air, and disappeared. Even the tall obelisk on which I had first taken my station began to fade from my sight. All was still and silent as the grave. The feeling of vacant loneliness was dreadful. I sunk insensible to the earth. I awoke. It was a dream, signed with a star. Now, that was definitely Mathew Franklin Whittier in December of 1832, writing about the old year passing away. Now we go to, whether you have fast forwarded or listened to the whole thing, that's a pretty good story. It's obviously symbolic of humanity, and the United States features prominently in it. There's references I don't understand that were period references. If you happen to be a scholar of 19th century history, you may have picked up some that I don't know. I would love it if somebody would write me and tell me what the references are. But here we have Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and other stories. The very last story, which is much shorter, by the way, right after the New Year's bells, which I read for you on the 24th, is The Old Year and the New. This is also Mathew Franklin Whittier's work. There's no real question about that because I proved the asterisk, the star for Mathew, and I proved that Durivage, tricked Mathew out of his portfolio. What's at issue here is, are these old? Were these written before A Christmas Carol? Because if this was written before A Christmas Carol, corresponding to the style that Mathew was using in the early 1830s, then the story which immediately precedes it, The New Year's Bells, which is a slap dead-on precursor of A Christmas Carol, if it was written earlier, was in fact something that Mathew and Abby used when they wrote A Christmas Carol. Okay, so this is style analysis by my lights. So this is only like, maybe a couple, 3 pages, something like that. So I'm going to read it straight through. I don't know that I've ever read this all the way through. So we shall see. The Old Year and the New. Oh, this is beautiful, beautiful indeed, cried a young and silvery voice, musical as fairy bells heard at midnight. How white the snowy drapery hangs upon the roofs of these bright palaces, and the speaker, a gay boy, danced trippingly along, following in the footsteps of an old gray-bearded man who was tottering before him. The old man turned. You call that snowy drapery beautiful, said he. Yes, it is like the raiment of a bride, said the boy. To me it seems a shroud thrown over the grave of buried hopes, answered the old man. But what are these joy bells ringing for, said the boy. For a death and for a birth, replied the old man. You speak riddles. I speak truth. The same sounds have a different import to different ears. To mine there is a death knell in these tremulous vibrations of the air. You are very old, father, and age has cankered you. A 12th month since, Young child of time, capital T, replied the old man, I was like you. A 12th month, your back is bent, your locks are silvery, your voice is tremulous. How is this? Wrinkles and gray hairs are the work of sorrows, not of years. Eyes that are weary of the sight of suffering grow dim apace. But hark, said the youth, hear you not that music, the peals of laughter that come from yonder illuminated house? It is a wedding festival. Yes, replied the old man sadly, a 12th month since I heard the same sounds in the same house. There was music and feasting. It was, as now, a wedding festival. Where is the bride? Go to yonder churchyard. You will find her name inscribed on a simple stone. If you pass out of the city to the north, you will see some huge buildings of brick towering upon an eminence. If you linger by the garden wall, you will hear shrieks and curses, the howls of despair, the ravings of hopeless lunacy. The husband is there, the victim of his own evil passions, a raving maniac. Away with these croaking reminiscences, cried the younger voice. Let the music peal. Let the dance go on. The wine is red within the cup. Yes, and the deadly serpent lurks below. Then the world is all desolate, cried the new year. No, there are green spots in the desert, said the old year, but beware of deeming it all fairyland. But a little while, and you will follow me. But the end is not here. After time, eternity. There, suffering and sin are unknown. There, each departed spirit, after making the circuit of its appointed sphere, shall rise to a higher and a higher, while boundless love and wisdom illuminate all, radiating from a center whose brightness no human senses can conceive. The old man was gone. The joyous bells had rung his requiem. The young heir was enthroned, and with mingled hope and foreboding commenced the reign of 1853. And again, that was not originally 1853. Durivage changed that. It was probably, I'm guessing, an earlier work from the one that I read you first, and probably was 1830, maybe 31. And for some reason, it never got published, remained in Mathew's portfolio of unpublished works, and Durivage put it at the very end of this. Note that we have here someone who believes in spirits, who is a Christian, who believes in heaven, and at this point he believes in heaven as eternity. He does not believe in reincarnation in 1830 or 31. He took it seriously, as we have seen in the last entry, by 1850. This is 1853. So that means that this story goes back to roughly 1830 or 31, probably before 1832. And it evinces essentially the same style as in the story I read you first. And it was definitely written well before A Christmas Carol. That means that the story which appears immediately before it, the New Year's Bells, was also very likely, if not definitely, from well before the time that A Christmas Carol was published. So that's a little style analysis, Sakellarios style. And I noticed a whole bunch of typos in that thing. I had to read around them. So I'm going to have to go back in and proof it against the original copy. But I've got, 4 o'clock now, roughly. So I've got some time to create some graphics for you and probably edit this tomorrow. I'm getting my first COVID-19 vaccine shot tomorrow. And also I got to pick up some groceries. So I figured I wanted to get a jump on this one because I won't have quite as much time tomorrow. I've been getting a few responses that dribble and drabble in. So far, no wow response. Polite. We're glad that you're studying this. And, you know, we encourage everybody to study and I encourage you to keep studying. And the last person that wrote me, I won't name the organization. This is an organization that traditionally has really focused on reincarnation. If anybody was interested, it should have been this one. And that was the response. And I wrote him back and I said, no, you don't understand. And the problem is he doesn't actually believe me. And this is the thing that I run across. It's so unbelievable. And people pretend to be nice. They're patronizing. But they betray themselves because if they actually believed this, they would be calling me on the phone. They would be booking a flight to come and talk to me about it. They would be inviting me on podcasts. They would be inviting me to speak to classes. So if people have this patronizing, lukewarm, keep up the good work, nice to talk to you response, I know that they didn't believe me, actually. So I would really rather have people flat out tell me I don't believe you than to do that. But sooner or later, there's got to come a time, there's got to come an epiphany where the small step that's just one step away, where people suddenly wake up and the light bulb goes off and they say, this is real. At that point, the wow response is going to be like a 2-story tall W on the wow. See, now nobody believes it, and therefore you get this reaction. From the people that like me, I get this, But as I told this fellow, you don't understand. Of course, I won't get a response to that. So I may do another update if there's important developments to tell you about. Otherwise, if something occurs to me, one thing leads to another, which leads to another, I'll do another entry. But meanwhile, I've got a little editing to do, so I'm going to get to that.